Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on the bottom of page 1342. Aleph Ayin Beis. If you're following the text, if you want to follow the text, you go to ayinbeis.com. Okay. So yesterday we learned the middle paragraph on this page, which, as I explained, is tying together and summing up and concluding basically the last 36 pages from Aleph Shimba from 1306. And what we learned was that from all the above we learn, we understand the difference between how Tzaddikim transform darkness and how Teshuva transforms darkness. They both transform, but one, the primary focus, like he says, Ha'ikar by Tzaddik is Amshachas Ha'er Mamayla. He's a man of light. He's a man of divine. He's a man or woman of divine light. So he brings Alakus, godliness, the soul, and everything that light represents, the light of Torah and mitzvahs from above, and through that, he transforms any darkness that he faces. Like he says in Tanya, that the great love, the avarabba b'tainugim, the great love and love of pleasures, tainugim, is so intense, it spills over into the left ventricle, the left side of the heart, which in regular people is where the animal soul resides. And here it gets transformed that any desires of Elam Hazah get directed toward Avos Hashem, loving God. He gave a few examples that we learned earlier, back on page 1323, Achilas Shabbos, Achilas Kainim, and general mitzvahs. It's all bringing godly Torah and godly mitzvahs into the physical world. The ayin is being nimshach into the yesh, the ayin of Eliki, the divine, we'll call it divine substanceless, is being brought into substance and transforming the substance. Ayin deshemas nasa yesh, until the yesh itself becomes like the shema mamsh. But we said clearly that this is all coming from light into darkness. But Teshuva, ha'ikar, same word, ha'ikar. The primary force is the opposite. Halos ha'cheshach. We're coming from the bottom up. It begins in a state of darkness. And that's the birur and the transformation of darkness from within. That we're taking the yesh and turning the yesh into ayin. Because tshuva amitis, true tshuva, what he means by true tshuva, he means not just the tshuva of a tzaddik, which is to go to higher levels, but true tshuva that's on sins and from a dark place, which comes min hametzar, from distress. It comes from the inner part, most part of the soul. From the intensity, the darker it is, the more powerful that tshuva is. Like the tshuva of Rabbi Elazar ben Derdaya, when he realized that it's completely, that it's hopeless and it's completely dependent on him, he won't be saved by anybody. So he cried out, he roared out from a state of distress, from very darkness, and that the chesh mitzvahs v'nepech la'ayim v'nasa er, and that is by reaching to the helam ha'atzmi, because the oir of the tzaddikim is rooted in oir. It's not rooted in helam. The helam of the Teshuva is rooted in darkness, so that's what it reaches to. However, by definition, darkness means concealment. So it's coming from a concealed place, and the transformation is also coming from within the concealment. And that's gvuras nimtokim b'sharshan. That means where the gvuras, the ultimate sweetening of the severities and the judgments, is not through chesed, not through another, but from the shadish of gvura itself. Shenimtokim ba'atzma shamtokim d'sharshan b'kem nasa b'chinas er v'gilu. So its root, which is the helam ha'atzmi, the core concealment, has now become revealed in this person. And this is the general difference between the bir er yashar, direct light, and er chezer, refractive light. Bir of shema, from the top down, and bir of shemban, er chezer, from the bottom up. And when it goes from the bottom up, it reaches the Hela Ma'atzmi, which is higher than Shema, even as it radiates from the Etzem, which is similar to what he said before. It's higher than the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachmim as they relate to Shema. Here we're talking about going to the Rachmim from Rachmacha Rabim Rachem Aleinu, the Rachim that comes from the Remus Atzmis that he said before, that's on a higher level, Hela Ma'atzmi. That's the summation of what we learned yesterday. And now he's going to take us back to page 1306, where he asked the questions about the difference between, so we know the difference between the Teshuva of a Tzaddik. We know the difference rather between a Tzaddik and Teshuva and about Teshuva. But what about the Teshuva of a Tzaddik? He hasn't mentioned the Teshuva of a Tzaddik right here. He did mention it earlier a few times, but now he's going to elaborate on that. On page 1339, for example, he mentioned it in the parentheses, but now he's going to elaborate and he's going to quote, let's go back to the Zohar. So the Zohar in 1306 began by saying that Mashiach osa la'asava tzaddikai b'tiyufta. Mashiach comes, Mashiach osa, la'asava means to return from the word tshuva, tzaddikai b'tiyufta, to return tzaddikim through tshuva. So Mashiach is going to do something in tzaddikim that they don't have on their own. He's going to bring them back through tshuva, which is an interesting twist here, because tzaddikim and tshuva seeming to be two different types of people. Tshuva is on a sin. And here we say tzaddikim are going to come back through tshuva, and Dafka Mashiach does that. So clearly something's going to happen in the future that's going to instill within the tzaddikim the quality of tshuva, but it's still tzaddikim's tshuva. It's not about tshuva's tshuva. So Rebbe Rashab is going to address that, and this is direct flow from back 1306. Just to go there for a moment, the L'cheda ain't moving, he said, the paragraph on 1396. Tshuva is on a sin. So what does it mean that tzaddikim will do tshuva, which is not shaykh to tzaddikim? So he says, okay, so there's a tshuva that's not on a chet. There's a form of tshuva that's not on a sin, on a transgression. Like it says, Ruach Toshav Elikim. I'm just reading from there, so just to keep the hemshech, the flow proper. So the spirit returns to Elikim, Hashem Nesana. That's the neshama going back to its source. A tzaddik is, of course, that's applicable to a tzaddik as well, even more so. Tzaddik also wants to go up higher and higher to godliness. So there's tshuva when you a transgression and one has wandered off the reservation and wandered away from God, and that's the tshuva to return. By a tzaddik, he says clearly the tshuva is to go back to the source, so that neshama comes down to a body, by a tzaddik as well. And the tshuva is to return as much as possible to keep going upward to connecting with God on deeper levels. So a tzaddik also has avodah. A tzaddik is not passive. He's not like, okay, I conquered the Yetzer Hara, I have no Yetzer Hara, I do nothing. A tzaddik is constantly working hard in his love and passion to God to go deeper and deeper, not just b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, but also b'chol ma'idecha, ave b'tainugim, to the point of constantly wanting to be absorbed to higher levels and higher levels endlessly. In the language of the Gemara, Talmidei Chacham or tzaddikim, ein lehem menucha lo b'olam hazeh v'lo b'olam haba. They don't have peace. Not in this world, not in the world to come. Yelcha mechayil al chayil. Yirah l'kim, kirah l'kim, but see it. They're going from strength to strength because it's Ein Sof. There's unlimited levels of elevation. So that's the Teshuva of Tzaddik. I'm going to read more from page 1306. It'll help us understand what we're learning now. Then he says, Shekol zeh Teshuva madrega aveda the neshama lekis. That this is a Teshuva in the Aveda of the divine soul, al pi poshet, but tshuva on its basic level, on its literal level, tshuva comes to repair the wound, the injury, the scar caused by a sin. And that is the quality that about tshuva has that a tzaddik doesn't have, because a tzaddik never went into such darkness. A tzaddik's tshuva is from good to better, and about tshuva is from bad to good. And that bad to good, that's the tikkun. And that's why it's with much more passion, with much more intensity. Because because it's coming close after there was distance. Who shubchinas kiruv b'yeser yisen er about dafke b'teicha chesher dafke. Min hameitzer karosika, from the distress you cry out. Through that comes anoni b'merchav. The response comes from an expansive place. So this is now exclusive to Baal Tshuva. To the point of merchav atzmi, the atzmus ein sof, from the expansiveness of atzmus ein sof. So now he goes back to the expression. So when the Zohar says that Mashiach will return the tzaddikim through tshuva, he's saying that tshuva will that tzaddikim. So what's the chiddush of the Zohar? That not just that tzaddikim have ruach toshav elokim, they have that we know they have. That's their avodah. They're always looking and seeking to connect and return to deeper levels of godliness. The Zohar is saying that they'll have the quality of the cheliyate, the intensity that a Baal Tshuva has from darkness, tzaddikim will also have. That's what Mashiach will give them. And that's the question he's asking here. The tzaddikim she'em ben shum pagam klam eichiyah b'mailas Baal Tshuva. How can they have that passion and that intensity when they never had an injury? There was never a wound. There was never a scar. There was never a transgression. So that's the question he asked there. So he's not sufficing by saying it's a different type of tshuva. You're saying that Mashiach is going to do a chiddush, that they're going to have the intensity of that. How is that? What does that mean? Gam tzarich lahavin. Another question is, what is taka the difference between the tshuva of tzaddikim and the tshuva of Baal Tshuva? The idea of zdeinus nasik kazach is for sure is not by tzaddikim because they don't have zdeinus. They don't have deliberate sins. They're even distant from inadvertent sins, let alone deliberate ones. So that's the second question. The quality of tshuva, the virtue of tshuva, is that evil, the negative, transformed to good. Now we find this also by tzaddikim. The Ave b'tainugim, and here he brings the Tanya Perek Tes that we learned yesterday as well. That chapter 9 in Tanya, he says that they're so filled with love that it spills over and extends to the left side, and it transforms the Tainug Elam Hazeh to Avos Hashem. We learned this yesterday, quoted it as well. So we see they also have the concept of transformation. That's called Ava b'tainugim. I'm just skipping a few lines. I'm just want to go straight. So since they have also a sapcha, what is the difference between their transformation and the transformation of Ra through tshuva? Now, actually, this question was answered in yesterday's class, in the paragraph we learned. The difference is Mamaylo Lamata, from Oyer to Choshech, rather than from Choshech to Oyer, from the bottom up. But still, I'm reading just to get the whole picture. And then he asks a fourth thing. The Gam Tzarech Lahavin, Gam Tzarech Lahavin, Mao Hefesh ben Abira de Er Yosher, Abira de Er Chezer. What is the difference in the Dover HaMizbarer, in the thing that's being refined? And this too, apparently, is already answered, but we're going to get more explanation in it. The Gam, a fifth point. How do you do a b'chal da mavarum b'chinas chesodin, and the mizbarer is from gvura. The mavarer, the refiner, the one who's doing the refinement, is chesed, and the mizbarer is gvura. We learned a lot about that ever since that page 1306. So he says, tikkun is from chesed, toyu is from gvura. Psel is the waste is from the kavas male, from the waste of the so the shavings of the zahav, which is gvura of gold, right? And there he brings, and there on top of 1307, he brings, and the birur is in different ways. You can have a birur from a higher light, which is like the birur of Eitz HaChaim, where the branch comes from a very high level that's higher than life and death, and that's why he can sweeten the gvura, like we learned. So he's already referring to that second level of sweetening here, though he didn't spell it out yet. And that Hamtok is not like like the first level of sweetening where you have more sweet waters than bitter waters. This is coming from a place that actually transforms it. But nevertheless, that's not gvuras nimtokim b'sharshan, like the third level of sweetening. So all this is already alluded and referred to back in 1306 and 1307. V'imkein, so sarich lahavin, and as the sixth question, we have to understand that that when the Hamtaka comes from Chesed, it's not the same level of sweetness as when it comes from the root of Gevura itself. And what's the Yisrael? What is the Inyan, and what's the quality that introduces over the second level of sweetening? So all this was asked back in 1306, 1307. Most of the answers we already have more or less, but now we're going to learn inside. He's actually going to refer to that Zoyar again and explain again, continuing where we left off, this idea. So we'll have answers to all the questions that he asked. Some of them, as I said, we already have answers to, but he's going to now elaborate more. So I'm glad we went back to that. So now we see the flow. So now I'm going to continue reading from the bottom of page 1342, the last paragraph, 3 lines from the bottom. So now, ma'ata tzarich lahovin, and from now that we've learned all this about the different levels of sweetening from within, from without, from top down, bottom up, the difference between tzaddikim and teshuva. So now we have to understand the question we asked back then, Masha Omer Bezeir Mashiach Osel Asovet Tzaddikai B'Tshuva. The Mashiach will come to bring the tzaddikim back to tshuva. Ma'u ha'hefesh ben tshuva de tzaddikim le'tshuva de balei tshuva. What's the difference between the two levels of tshuva? So now we're going to understand that. V'loma tshuva de tzaddikim hu ha'yidei Mashiach. And why is the tshuva of tzaddikim dafke through Mashiach? It doesn't say they will do tshuva. It says Mashiach will bring them to tshuva. Dafke. Ha'yidei Mashiach dafke. Explicitly, specifically through Mashiach. And we also have to understand what kind of tshuva is this? What's this personality of the tshuva of tzaddikim? They have no sin or transgression at all. As we learned earlier, what he's referring to is back to 1306 that we just summed up. So what he's doing now is going back to those questions. As I said, some of them we already have answers to, but it's always good. The Rebbe Rashab is himself going to spell it out. So move now to page 1343, the next page. Acha inyanhu. Now, based on what we learned, he's going to explain this. The inyan of this is like this. The hine, and remember, we learned the difference in tzaddikim and balei tshuva, but now he's going to explain the tshuva, the difference in their very tshuva, in their return. Okay, very fundamental line. Let's translate that line. The Mahusat Tshuva is different case by case. So the personality of Tshuva comes in each scenario, B'chol Dover, in every situation, or in every situation, I would say, according to that state and its location, so to speak. In other words, its level, its state and its level. So, for example, one person's tshuva is different than another person's tshuva, depending where you're at. If one person is, God forbid, involved in very gross activity that is completely antithetical, their tshuva consists of a certain intervention. Think of it like in medicine. Medical intervention is according to the diagnosis of the patient. So the same thing, tshuva, the spiritual intervention and spiritual healing is according to the situation and the matzav or the madrega and the mokum of the one that is doing that tshuva, has that tshuva. So that's the statement he makes. And Musa tshuva, in other words, is different and it's all commensurate to the situation that we're dealing with. For who? And he's talking about the basic level of tshuva in a sense. Sheshav b'tshuva, that he returns, which means he regrets and corrects his ways. L'sakin habagam, to repair the wound or to repair the injury, the spiritual injury. Shahu lefi madregose, the bagam that lefi what his level. And every person has a different bagam based on their behavior, based on their actions. So in other words, that we see from this that tshuva is very different and diverse. It's not one size fits all. It's very customizable and very unique to each given situation, like I just explained. Ukidua, and as it's known, she has b'chinas naran shebeneshama. The neshama has, we know, 5 levels, but he's talking about the 3 conscious ones, the 3 revealed ones: nefesh, ruach, neshama. We learned about this a lot earlier in Ayin Beis. Basically, nefesh is more the biological part of a person's life, the behavioral. Ruach is usually the emotional, midas. So nefesh would be nihi, netzach yesod. Ruach would be chagas, chesed gvura teferes, and neshama would be moichin, the intellectual component, which is chachma bina das. So there's the soul consists of different dimensions. Ubavade yuchalias begam benaran, and certainly it's possible that there should be an injury, a wound or a scar, due to a certain sin in the naran. And tshuva is the repair. So just as it is in the physical world, a person gets injured, God forbid, or there's or something that's a disease or an infection. Infection is a better word. So then you need something to heal it. So it's either medicine, surgery, if necessary, or other forms of repairing something that was injured. In Ruchnius and Chele HaNefesh, you have the same idea. A person who does something that goes against God's will, or does not do something that he was supposed to do. So in both scenarios, a pagam, there's an injury, a spiritual injury, some type of dissonance and disconnect between the person. Now, this is what's called the pagam in Nefesh Ruach Neshama. And the tshuva comes to repair and heal this dissonance, to realign it, to reconnect it. Like the word Aveda, for example, comes from the word Havara Mirshus L'Rishus. Doesn't just mean a sin. Aveda means displacement. When you move away from where you belong, when you're displaced. Mitzvah comes from the word connection. So you can say a mitzvah is a connection and Aveda is a disconnection. So when there's a disconnection, you need to reconnect. That's the tshuva. And certainly you cannot compare the wound in the level of nefesh to a wound or a scar in the level of ruach of the neshama. And a wound or scar in the level of ruach is not compared to one in neshama. And he's going to explain now a bit based on what I just said. I'm sorry. If the sin was an actual behavior, like I said, behavioral, that's in nefesh. So, for example, if a person did let's talk ben adam lechavere. Someone hurt someone. They insulted them. They spoke lashon hara. They cheated them. I mean, whatever it may be. Or they deprived them of something they deserved. They're not pay an employee. Whatever the pagam is, it's an action-based pagam because you did something. It's not based purely on feelings. It's based on actions. So then the correction, the tikkun, the repair, is the fibiyab gam shebebchinas ma'aseh. You need to repair it on that level. You can't just sit in your house and meditate and say, I regret what I did. You have to say, I'm sorry. You have to maybe reparations, like nizikin. All the halachas, hilchas nizikin of damages. You cause damage. There has to be a correction, reparations to correct the damage, whatever that reparation is. If you hurt If you affected someone's property, you damaged someone's property, you have to go correct. You have to fix the property. So tshuva is not just in your heart, it's also regarding, it all relates to what the crime was. Like you see in any court of law, punishment will be meted out based on what the crime was. Based on the crime, that's how you get the punishment, or the judge, the justice is served, and the tshuva is according to what your person did. And a dissonance or a scar or wound or injury in the level of ruach, which is midas. That is a more subtle and a more internal type of injury. That would be if you hurt somebody's feelings, or you did not show the proper love to someone. So it wasn't an action in the sense where you actually did something. So the tikkun has to be a ma'aseh. Let's call it an emotional sin, if you wish, an emotional transgression, an emotional toxin. So there, it's daka primi yesa because it's not as tangible.
It's showing love or feeling love? You just use the word showing love, which is an action.
Let me just finish. I'm middle. 1 second. Let me finish, and then I'll stop for questions. 1 second. And there, the tshuva has to be commensurate to the crime or to the transgression. So the tshuva is also more primiistic. It's not just based on pure action, as it is in nefesh. Now you're talking about ruach, midas, in emotions and feelings. What do you want to ask or say?
No, I thought you were talking about midas when you said if he doesn't show love, but that it's feeling itself without showing. If you show love, it's a lacking of doing something in terms of myself. I mean, I just want to.
We're not talking about that. We're talking about a pagam, a sin in midas. Midas adam, a person v'haftarecha kamocha is a mitzvah of midas.
Right.
So that's we're talking about a different type of.
No, you said showing love, which is.
I don't know what you mean. I never said.
You used the word showing love to somebody. You did. You said showing love to somebody.
I didn't.
Showing up.
I'm right here. I never said showing love. Okay. What do you mean showing love? What does showing love mean?
I mean acting with love towards a person or showing.
That's a mitzvah to act with love.
Fine, but that's a ma'aseh. That's not in ruach. I don't think. That's what I'm asking you.
Well, yes, it is. That's a midah. It's called a mitzvah sheba midas, a mitzvah sheba lev. V'hafta is a mitzvah sheba lev. It's an emotional thing. It doesn't require an action.
Right.
So is it like being?
What are we discussing? I'm not sure. Why is this so confusing?
Well, what's the nature of a chet at the level of midas? That's the question.
The mitzvah of sinah, when you hate somebody, it says you should not dislike someone. For example,
okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah,
I mean, I can give 100 examples. Anywhere where a person or avos Hashem, the opposite of not having avos Hashem. It's a mitzvah to have avos Hashem, v'ahavta Hashem elokecha. You're aggressive with somebody instead of being gentle and kind. These are
that's ma'aseh. That's
not ma'aseh. That's not ma'aseh. That's midas. That's not like going into someone's house or property and damaging it. That's ma'aseh. This is called midas. Okay, upagam de neshama. Hu b'bchinas meichin. And the wound or injury at the level of neshama is the third level of meichin de chochma bina. Shu b'pnimius yesed. That's even more pnimius, because it's even more subtle and more refined than midas. If you want to pagam and meichin, is if a person uses their mind for destructive purposes, or they use their mind to study things that are negative. You know, you could study the Nazis had philosophies that were very, very obscene and destructive. So the mind could also be involved in very destructive behavior. But it's not actions necessarily, it's on the level of the mind. When the mind becomes polluted, it can be in many forms of how a mind can become polluted. In Tanya, in chapter 8, which I'm teaching now, at the end of the chapter, he talks about sins in action, in speech, and in thought, and in mind. So that maybe has something in common here, not completely, but because it doesn't say speech here. Here he's talking Maisa, Midas, and Meichen. So in certain ways, even though a sin in action is more destructive, technically speaking, but one in the mind, a corrupt mind, and a distorted mind is a far more subtle and more dangerous. Because someone who's malevolent is the right word in their mind can create a lot more problems. So it's a level of tuma, a level of impurity, or we can say here what we call dissonance, that's even deeper than in action. Like, for example, let's say when you're dealing with a conflict management between spouses or between partners in business. So if someone did something to the other, but there isn't an emotional component to it, so then it's easier to correct. If there's an emotional dislike from one to the other, or even deeper, that their mind, their mind doesn't tolerate the other person, or their thoughts and ideas are literally they literally reject the other, it's much more complicated to correct because you're dealing with a much more inward faculty, which is not just create behavioral change. You're looking for emotional change or intellectual change. Cognitive change is much more difficult because it's much more subtle. Point being is that the pagam in one is different than the other, and the tshuva in each one is different. And it could be on all levels. It could be on one level. It could be level 2 or level 3 of nefesh, ruach, and neshama. It's an example to show how tshuva ba b'chol dover lefi madrigosei mekayme. As it was explained earlier in the Maimer Shuv Yisrael, right, in volume 1, page 145 and on, he spoke about these different levels. Does anyone want further clarity on this? I'll stop right here before I read on.
I have a question, Rabbi Jacobson.
No, since I see that this seems to be, 1 second. You need to find examples within your life, hopefully not in your life, but examples in life where you have these three different types of corruption, if you wish. There's behavioral, emotional, and cognitive.
Rabbi Jacobson, remember we talked about the fact that the system is yesh, ayin, and yesh. Could it be said that on one level in the Olam Hazeh, the Tzaddikim are going from, as you said, ayin to yesh, and the Baal Tshuva is going from the lower yesh to the ayin? Is it fair to say that what we're talking about, the Tzaddikim doing Teshuva, is them going from the ayin to the yesh, the other yesh, the original yesh?
Your question has nothing to do with what we just learned. You're asking about the previous paragraph we learned yesterday?
Yes, just a little clarity, sorry.
Okay, so if you don't mind, I'll address that afterwards because it's
Okay,
not
no
what
problem.
we're learning right now.
No
That's
problem.
a question on yesterday's paragraph that you're asking me. Does anybody want clarity on what we just learned, the last few lines? If you look in Tanya in chapter 3, and then in chapter 6, where he talks about the nefesh alikis, nefesh habamis, the koiches. So in chapter 3, he talks about how the faculties of the divine soul are all consumed with godliness. The chokhmah, the bina, the das. The opposite of that is when your mind, and that's where I'm like neshama, is consumed with self-interest and self-indulgence. So your mind is now essentially a vehicle for the impurity of the animal soul, of the klippa of the animal soul. Because your mind, instead of being consumed and involved and preoccupied with understanding God and connecting to God, it's preoccupied with what your mind is plotting, even if it's not purely destructive, but it's selfish. And then he goes on with the midas as well, emotions. Many people's emotions, if it's directed toward godliness, toward serving God, toward loving God, that's the nefesh alikis. When it's not, the midas is involved in your own emotional impulses and emotional needs and whims and all the different things that seduce our emotions. And then there's behavioral, there's actions. So it's very clear that in our lives, all three are constantly in play. And you can actually break down when a person looks at themselves, you can diagnose and say, where's the problem? Now, it could be on all levels, it could be one level, it could be primarily one. The point is there are different types of pagomim. It's like different injuries, and a physical level is a different between an injury where you get a little scratch on your finger, or an injury, God forbid, a head injury, or a heart injury, and a more vital organ. So the same thing here. Each one he's not comparing and saying which is worse, but there's difference. The difference is the key thing. And obviously on the behavioral, it's more tangible. As you work toward emotions and then to the cognitive, it's more subtle. So the mele of al derech zeh, mischalik inyan hatshuva. Okay, so therefore, let me correct that. So therefore, you see different types of begonim. So the tshuva is commensurate in each case. It requires, like a person, let's say, whose mind has been preoccupied with things that are self-interest, one of the tikkun is to learn Torah. Learning Torah, using the mind for holy purposes and the holy ends and objectives, corrects and helps heal the mind being used for the wrong thing. Same thing, emotions, and the same thing with behavior. So each thing requires its own type of tshuva. So that's the first thing he says. So tshuva is commensurate. This is all meant to explain the difference between tzaddikim and bali tshuva, but he's explaining with havana, with an understanding that the tshuva is based on, obviously, the person's behavior, what the situation is. Val derech zeh mischalik, and similarly, mischalik inyan hatshuva b'cholos neshamis Yisrael. So now he's giving another distinction. Just as there's a distinction in tshuva between whether it's, according to the madrego mekayme, the situation that we're dealing with, whether it's in whether it's nefesh, ruach, or neshama, there's also a distinction in the general category of the souls of Israel, mebchinas regel ad bchinas reish. Souls are different. There are souls that are on the level of regel. This also explains in Tanya chapter 2. Like we say, Reshechem Shivtechem, and to the other extreme is Chet Ve'etzecha V'Shem Memecha. Reshechem Shivtechem means the head and leaders of the tribes, to the point of those that the wood choppers and the water carriers. So there's Atam Nitzavim. So in neshamas there are levels. There's neshamas that are connected to the regel. Remember in Tanya Ayin Beis he says that we all originate from Adam Harishon. So all souls are like one organism. There's souls that are more connected to the Reish, which is like Resh B'nai Yisrael, the leaders. Rebbe is actually Rosh Tevis, Resh B'nai Yisrael, Reish B'nai Yisrael. So the leaders of the people, and then there are neshamas that associate more with the regel, like Ikfisa, the Mashiach, we say Ikfisa, we say the heel, they come from lower levels. So Shein Rosh Alfi Yisrael, they're the Rosh Alfi Yisrael, the Reish. V'chol hagodol yeser. So now that their souls are different, he's going to explain their tshuva is also different. V'chol hagodol yeser, and the greater the person, pagama yeser bepnimius. The wound and the crime and the injury is deeper. Why? Because a person who's a simpler person, they transgress, obviously they also need to correct it. But if it comes from a person who's on a very high level, he's a role model. And he's a person who everyone looks up to, like a Moshe Rabbeinu. So for him, even one shift is far worse than a neshama of a lower level. And he needs a higher level of tshuva. Okay. So two key things he said here, that tshuva is commensurate to the situation and to the behavior, like whether it's nefesh, ruach, neshama. And the second thing is that it depends on the level of the neshama. And there too, it's different. Like for example, we say Moshe Rabbeinu hit the rock instead of speaking to the rock. And this was considered a big thing. Because of that, he couldn't go into Eretz Yisrael. Now think about it. Speaking to a rock and hitting a rock are both a miracle. A rock doesn't give out water, whether you speak to it or you hit it. So what did Moshe do? He didn't say, well, if he said there's no water, you can't extract water from a rock. So then he's questioning God's very commandment. He didn't say that. He said, I spoke to the rock, it didn't work. Like I did, I spoke to the rock, so let me hit it like I did it last time. So he just changed what Hashem said, but he still expected water to come from the rock. But since it was Moshe Rabbeinu, and everybody was watching this, if Moshe could change even one word from God and not follow, that meant a serious thing on the level of Moshe. The Gemara, for example, says that Reb Chia would not buy meat on credit. You know, it's a completely Torah-dic concept. You can buy something on credit and pay later. But he didn't want anyone to think that he's taking the meat and didn't see them pay. It would create perhaps a Chil Hashem will say, hey, Reb Chia is taking meat. I think it's Reb Chia, if I recall correctly. He's taking meat and he's not going to pay for it. But it's a normal thing, credit. But for a person on that level who's being watched and he's a public figure and has a stature, every little thing counts. I mean, the way I'll just explain it further. The Gemara says, Revav al-beged Talmid Chacham, a piece of dust on the garment of a scholar, of a Talmid Chacham, is considered a major crime. A piece of dust on a garment, because his garment is a Talmid Chacham. So even a little piece of dust is a major thing, like the way the joke goes. The Jewish relativity theory, that 3 hairs on your head is not much, but 3 hairs in the soup. So it's all relative. If a piece of dust falls on your finger, it's insignificant. If a piece of dust falls into your eye, it's very irritating. Why? Same dust. Because the eye is a much more sensitive organ. And every little piece of dust matters. In the Kodesh Kodashim, one blemish, that's another good word for pagam, by the way, blemish. One blemish in the Kohen Gadol, in the high priest, he could die in the Holy of Holies. Why doesn't he die outside of the Holy of Holies? Because the Holy of Holies is so intense, the light and the power, that every little thing matters. Everything is magnified, so to speak. So basically what he's saying, the greater the neshama, the more the pagam has impact. Even though his sin, his pagam, his blemish may be a small one, relatively speaking. But for him, it's a big one, and that's why it requires Teshuva law. When Elisha ben Avuya, one of the 4 that went into the Pardes, the orchard, why was it such a terrible thing? Because he was Yudeus Rebbeinu. He was considered one of the greatest scholars of the time. He knew his master, and yet he rebelled. So that's considered far worse than if it was a simple person. So just to explain a little more what he means, the pagam is Yeser b'pnimius, and you need a Teshuva law Yeser. And now with that, he goes back to understanding and with this we'll understand, similarly we'll understand also Teshuva and Tzaddikim. What does Teshuva and Tzaddikim mean? We know that they don't have sins. It's a Teshuva not compared to the Teshuva Baal Teshuva. It's a Teshuva compared to them. Erkam, the fee according to their level. They require a deeper level, a higher level of tshuva, a higher tshuva, and an innermost one. Not due to the very blemish, because that could be very minor. Even though they didn't injure, they didn't cause any damage at all. Gamba pnimius v'dakus. Also, even a more subtle and inner and subtle one. But rak mipnei erkom u'malosam ba'avedus hakedesh. But the fierach, relative to their quality and their stature in the holy service of God, ba'avedus hakedesh hi anesenes sheyachshavu k'cheiti mamish. That can leave room that they should be considered as if they're sinners, mamish sinners. And even more than someone who actually sinned in actuality. In other words, one little subtle shift by them can be considered. It's not if you weigh it on a scale, it's not a pagam. Like I said, it's a piece of dust. But on their level, it can be considered relative to their level as kechet mamish, and even more than the sin of an actual sin of a person, of a sinner who actually sinning in actuality. Oh, we learned that earlier. That those that are surrounded by God, he says, what does it mean that those that are closer and surrounded by God, there's much more digduk, much more precision in the judgment of them. Kechut asayra means even like a hair breath. So usually you give somebody some allowance and some latitude. But when it comes to tzaddikim, on that level, kechut asayra, if they go off even a drop, it's considered a tremendous thing compared to their level. And the explanation is obvious, like I said before, the higher you are, every little thing matters. Because the greater a person is than his colleague, than his friend, than another, the greater is the chet relative to his quality of being, his quality, his stature. Even though this so-called blemish, relatively speaking, is bedakus ma'id, it's very subtle, like a chut asayda, like literally like the strand of a hair. However, it's considered more of a blemish, more of a chet, than someone who actually sinned. Pochus erech b'dvar avera gdela. A second. Pochus erech b'dvar avera gdela. Yeser yachshav. Oh, if by someone who sinned was on a lower level, even if he did a greater sin, but since he's on a lower level compared to him, this person on a higher stature, that little shift is considered worse in a certain way. Now we're going to stop here. He's going to explain this more next section. He says, "V'yuvan zeh al derech Moshe." He's going to explain this as we learn further. So it's not finished, the topic. And based on this, he's going to go back and explain what Teshuva by Tzaddikim means. So definitely adding a whole new dimension that we didn't learn till now. This isn't just elaboration of what we learned. There is much more here of this higher level of Teshuva. Now, there's many, many explanations for this, and I'm going to definitely elaborate on it. But if anybody has any questions, please. But remember, it's not finished, the topic. Yeah. So I'm going to stop here by this section. B'yuvan zeh. Floor is yours. Anybody want clarification or questions? Okay. So I'll stop the recording here at middle of page 1343.